Alright guys, this is Mahesh again and welcome back to lesson 3 of module 1. This module is part theoretical in nature and part practical in nature. But this is very important to understand how Azure works. So let's start with lesson 3, which is resource manager. In this lesson, we are going to discuss about the resource manager, what exactly it is, certain terminologies, resource group deployments. We'll also discuss about what resource manager locks are. How do you move resources from one resource group to another? How do you remove those resources as well as resource group? And then a small demonstration on resource group. So let's talk about a resource manager. Before talking about that, I wanted all of you to focus on the right hand side, this image that we have. Okay, have you ever wondered how can a simple click on Azure can create a virtual machine, or how a simple click on Azure can create a storage account, or how writing a command within your PowerShell can execute something on Azure data center? So I want to visualize. I want all of you to visualize something. This is you can leave your laptop as of now and you can just focus on listening what I'm saying. So we know that Microsoft has data centers, right? Within the data centers, a lot of physical hosts are there, physical servers are there. When you go to Azure portal and you click on create a VM and then you click on add button and you say create now, you do 5 or 6 clicks and then you say create now. What is happening in between? That is what matters. So whenever you use any kind of tool, by tool I mean Azure portal, PowerShell, CLI, and even Visual Studio, which we will discuss inside the development track, not here. Whenever you use this tool, what is happening? Whenever you are writing a command in PowerShell or CLI, or whenever you are clicking to create a VM on Azure, what is happening is you are calling an API. Now, people who are not coming from the development background might not know what APIs are, but think of API as a method which helps you to interact with Azure environment, which is running on the backend within the data center. So when you do that click, when you run that command, what is happening is you are accessing the Resource Manager API. The Resource Manager API is accessing the Azure environment, which are running on the backend data center through something which is known as resource providers. I will let you know what resource providers are, but here think of resource provider uh, as an endpoint which helps you in creating the resources that you want to create. So when you're when you're writing a PowerShell command or when you're clicking on Azure portal, there are a lot of things in between which helps you in getting the appropriate resource that you want to create on Azure. Why clicking on Azure VM does not create an SQL database? Because there is something in between which is allowing you to create only a VM when you click on the button on the create VM option, right? So what are those things? First thing is resource manager API, which in turns contact resource provider. Okay, so remember these two words. So what is Resource Manager API? It provides a consistent management layer. You can access Resource Manager API through portal, through command line. All of the requests that you're creating, all of the tasks that you want to perform on Azure, they will always go to Resource Manager API, whether you initiate it with Azure portal or through command line or through Visual Studio, it will go to Resource Manager API. Resource Manager API also it helps you in grouping your resources. Let's understand this with a diagram now. Okay, so we know what Resource Manager API is. It's an interface, it's a management layer in between. Now let's suppose in your environment you want to have a virtual machine, you want to have a subnet within which this virtual machine is deployed. You also want to have a virtual network, because subnet cannot be deployed without a virtual network, right? There might be an SQL database that with this virtual machine might be connected to, and there might be a web application. What I'm trying to say over here is you might have multiple resources which are related to each other, right? Because that's how you create an environment. All your resources are related to each other. You do not have a virtual machine sitting in one place which has no interaction with the SQL DB. If they don't have the interaction with each other, how do they interact? How do they give you the solution that you want, right? So the resources, when I say resources in here, I mean the individual instances of any of the Azure service. So when I say a VM is a resource. An Azure SQL database, that's a resource. Web application, that's a resource. So all these resources which are connected to each other, or in other terms, which shares the same life cycle, they should be arranged in such a manner that they remain inside a logical group. This logical group is known as your resource group. So instead of individually having these things, uh, uh, instead of individually managing these things, what I can do is I can create something in Azure which is known as resource group. Now, resource group is nothing. Resource group is a logical grouping of the resources which shares first the same life cycle. By life cycle, I mean they are all related to each other. And second, they share the same metadata. By metadata, I mean the information about the resources itself. Do not focus on the second option, focus on the first option. Resource groups are logical grouping of Azure resources based upon their life cycle, based upon their relation with each other. For example, let's say within your environment, you have, within your organization, you have a dev environment. So all the virtual machine, all the databases, all the web application, all the virtual network, all the subnets, all the similar kind of resources which you are using for the development environment, you might want to put them inside one resource. Similarly, all the resources for QA you want to keep within the QA resource group. Similarly, for other environments like for production, you want to keep all the production related resources in a production resource, right? So resource group is a segregation of your resources based upon how related they are to each other. You do not, maybe you do not want to mix match dev and QA environment together, okay? Or let's take another scenario. Instead of environments, let's say you have business unit. Maybe you want to keep all the different resources which you want to use for finance business unit in one resource group. All the resources that you want to use for IT business unit, you want to keep them within one resource group. All in all, resource group allows you to manage lots of resources without having the need to individually manage them, because they are all part of a logical group. So what are the benefits of it? There is one single group to manage. Now, let's suppose I wanted to uh, manage all these resources. It will be a very hectic task for me if I want to manage these resources individually. Okay, so instead of managing them individually, I will be managing it from the resource group itself. Think of it as a folder. A folder has what? A folder can have multiple files. Now, if you want to give access to all those files, what do? You can give access to the folder, and automatically access is inherited to all the subsequent files within the folder. Similar to that, in resource group also, if you give access on the resource group to someone, it will be inherited by all the resources which are within that resource group. So there is one single group to manage. You do not have to individually manage your resources. If you want to delete all of these resources at once, you do not have to individually go to these resources and then click on delete. You can say, okay, delete my resource group. All the resources will be deleted, right? There is one single group to manage rather than individually managing the resources. Consistency. Let's suppose you created a resource group and you deployed all your resources within it. And now you wanted to create the same environment with same resources. Resource group also provides you a way to generate a template based upon which you can create a new iteration of the same environment. So let's suppose within my resource group there are 10 VMs, 2 SQL databases, 3 web application, 4 NIC, 3 virtual network, etc. I wanted to create the same environment but in a different resource group. So with the help of the templates which resource group will provide to us, we can create a new iteration of the same environment without any kind of human errors, because the environment is already created. You are just taking a template of it. We'll talk about that template as well. Resource group also helps you in correct order of deployment. For example, let's suppose you are creating a VM. Can a VM be created before a virtual network? No. So when you want to create a virtual machine, first a virtual network should be created, then a subnet, then within the subnet there should be a virtual machine which will be deployed, and before deploying the virtual machine there should be OS disk and data disk that should be created, right? So there is a procedure of creating a VM. A VM is not created directly. There are dependencies on VM. These dependent resources are created first and then the VM is created. So this this resource group makes sure that a particular arrangement is made when you're deploying a VM on, or any resource on any resource group. Access control, I have already told you about that. With the help of access control, you can control the access from the resource group level. So you give access on the resource group level, it will be automatically inherited by all the resources within the resource group. Let's suppose you created a resource group for dev environment. So all the people who wanted to work on dev environment, instead of individually giving them access on each and every resource, I will say, okay, all the dev environment people, let's get access onto your resource group, your dev resource group, and they will simply have access to all the resources within it. And finally, tags. You can also create tags. Tags are nothing. Tags are specific information that you provide to your resource group or even to your resources, and we'll talk about tags later on. Okay, so understand what a resource group is. You can always mention the question within my within my comment section. Okay, now next thing here is deploy, update, or delete in a single coordinated operation. This is something that I have already told you about the resource groups. It provides security, auditing, and tagging features, right? I told you that instead of individually managing these resources, you can manage them as a group now. That's what resource manager does. That's what groups are meant for. Certain terminologies are there within it. What is a resource? A resource is simply a single service instance in Azure. What is a single service instance? Like I said before, understand the difference between the service and a resource. For example, if I go to my Azure portal, app is a service. Function app is a service. SQL database is a service. Azure Cosmos DB is a service. Virtual machine is a service. These are all what? These are services. Services provides me a way to create a resource onto that service. For example, if I want to create a virtual machine, I go to virtual machine service and I will click an add button, and then I will give all the details and it will create a single instance of a virtual machine, which is what? That is my resource. So service is the functionality which you use, and the resource is the instance that you will create based upon that functionality. Okay, so when I say what is a virtual machine is a service, but your virtual machine that you are creating, that's a resource for you, which you are creating by using the Azure Virtual Machine service. If I want you to create a virtual network is a service, but the virtual network that you have created by using Azure Virtual Network service is your resource. So the implementation of that service within your environment is a resource. The actual service is what Azure has provided to you. Then there is resource manager template. The next module is all about resource manager template. Templates are basically a JSON file which have some code written within it. With the help of that code, you can create the same environment again. So a template is like a reflection of what you have within your resources or within your resource group. It provides you a way to automate the environment that you have already built, and think of it as a snapshot. So you can just take a template will give you all the code within it. You can reuse this template and recreate the environment. Okay, it's majorly used for automation purposes. This template uses declarative syntax. When you come to scripting languages or programming languages, there are two kinds of languages: imperative language and declarative language. What is imperative language? Imperative language is something which is sequential in nature. So when you go to PowerShell uses imperative syntax. When I say imperative, what does it mean? It is sequential in nature. For example, if I want to create a VM on PowerShell, you can also go to Google and search for what is the command for creating VM on PowerShell. So it will ask you to create a virtual network first. So the first command that you will see is of creating a virtual network, creating a resource group, creating an operating system disk, choosing the size, etc. And at the very last, you will run the command to create a VM, because it goes sequentially, right? If you miss any step in between or any command in between, your virtual machine will not get created, because it has dependencies on all those previous command, all those previous resources. This is imperative kind of syntax. Declarative syntax simply focus on the end result. Rather than going sequentially, you are declaring an end result. You are saying, I want this virtual machine with this size and this way. It doesn't matter how you create it, what are the what is the sequence of creating it. I just at the end of this implementation, at the end of this JSON template that I'm using, I should get my resources, and these are the settings with which I should get it. That is declarative syntax, in which when you initially declare all the things, and then you just simply push your template. It doesn't matter whether things are arranged sequentially in it or not, it will give you the end result. What's the benefit of this? It doesn't matter whether you will create whether you will provide the virtual network information first or not. It will not give you an error, because you have provided the end state. You have declared the end state within your environment in the beginning itself. That's declarative syntax. So JSON based templates use declarative syntax when you want to use them. And the resource provider, this is very important. What is a resource provider? I'll give you an example. When you want to work on virtual machine, the resource provider is, let me write it in here. The resource provider is known as Microsoft.compute. If you talk about virtual network, the resource provider is Microsoft.network, if I remember correctly. Similarly, we have a resource provider for database, web application, etc. Let's see what all resource provider we have and what do they actually do. Okay, so what are these resource provider? Let me show you all the resource providers. These are all the resource provider. It starts with Microsoft and then dot and the name of the service that you are using. Okay. What is the use of these resource provider and why they are there within this environment of Azure? So resource provider is basically an implementation of a service based upon which certain resource types are defined. Let me explain this to you with an example. If you go back to my paint in here, I told you that if you want to work on VM, there is a Microsoft.compute resource provider. What Microsoft.compute resource provider does is basically it gives you all the ways to interact with a VM, right? So this resource manager API that I was talking about in the previous slide, if you remember, what they do is, let me go over here. You initiated a request to create a VM through portal, let's say. It will go to the resource manager API. Resource manager API will define whether it is meant for a virtual machine or for a web app or for an SQL database or any other service in Azure. And how does it define it? Based upon the resource providers. So for each of the service in Azure, there is a resource provider defined. That is why when you click on the portal, the resource manager API redirects your request to the Microsoft.compute resource provider and not to Microsoft.network resource provider. Why? Because your request was initiated for a VM, it should go to the appropriate resource provider. Based upon the resource provider, you get certain set of actions that you can perform. For example, in a virtual machine, you can reset a virtual machine, right? That action will be defined within the Microsoft.compute resource provider. It won't be there inside a virtual network. Why? Because you do not restart a virtual network. You either create it or modify it or delete it. So based upon the resource provider, you will get to know what specific actions you can perform on that resource, right? So resource, you go to your tool, you initiated a request, it went to the resource manager API, then it goes to the appropriate resource provider, and from there, whichever action you have executed, it will be performed. So you now understand what a resource provider is. If you do not understand it, mention it within the comment along with your query, or search for it on Google, go to the Microsoft articles and read more about it. This is very important to understand what a resource provider is. Now, I told you about the resource groups. What are resource groups? Resource groups are a way to logically group your resources within one single logical container. All resources in Azure should always exist in only one resource group. I created a VM, it should be a part of a resource group. I created a network, it should be a part of a resource group, right? Resource group cannot be renamed. Once you have created a resource group, there is no way to rename it. The name cannot be changed. You have to delete the resource group and recreate it if you want to rename it. Groups can have resources of many different types. Within a resource group, I can create a virtual machine, I can create a virtual network, I can create an SQL database, app service, anything I want. Because resource group is nothing, it is just a logical group which contains resources which shares the same life cycle. Resource group can also have resources from different locations. Let's suppose you have a resource, let's suppose you have a VM in East US and you have an SQL database in West US. They both can be a part of the same resource group. That is possible. And deployments are incremental in nature within the resource groups. One of the good thing about resource groups are you can put locks over there. Let's see what these locks are. So let me go and go to my resource group here. This is the resource group that I created. As of now, this resource group does not have any resources within it, right? So what I'll do, I'll go to virtual network because creating a virtual network is very simple and effective. Do not worry about how I'm creating this virtual network. What is the procedure? I will let you know because there is a whole module for that. So I'm going to virtual network, giving it a name. Let's say my virtual network, some address space to it. Let's say 10.0.0.10.0.0/16, and I want it says what resource group you want to put this virtual network in. Remember, virtual network is a resource. It has to be a part of a resource group because, like I said, the first point was a resource should always be in a resource group. So I will be putting it inside my RG, selecting a location. I will be letting you know what a location is all about. A subnet, let's say 10.0.0.0/24, and simply click on create. Do not worry about other options. We will be coming to that as well, right? Now, what I have done, what you should know as of now is I have simply created a resource which is of type virtual network, and I'm going to deploy this within the resource group that I have already created. So now if you go to resource groups and if you click on my RG, you will see a virtual network in here after some time. You can check the status of it by going to the notification button and you can see that the deployment is in progress. You can click on this option and you can see where exactly the deployment is currently. So it says it is still deploying, and this is the name of what? This is the name of the provider, resource provider, Microsoft.virtual network, which is helping you create it. In the case of VM, the name of this provider would be Microsoft.compute, and based upon any kind of resource that you're creating, an appropriate resource provider will be selected. So let's wait for this, and once this is created, you will see them within the resource group, right? So now I have what? I have a resource group, and within the resource group, I would have a virtual network very soon. But we were talking about locks. So what are locks now? If you go to resource group and if you scroll down on the left hand side, there is a button which is known as locks. See, I told you in resource group you can have many resources, right? But what if somebody accidentally deletes your resource? If something happens at the resource group level, all the resources within it will be affected, right? So let's suppose somebody deleted a resource group and all my resources was there within the resource group itself. That will create a havoc for me, right? That will be a very bad situation for me. In that kind of scenario, Microsoft says that you can implement locks on resource groups as well as resources. There are two kinds of lock. The first one is read only. The second one is delete. Let's give this lock a name. I'm giving it my lock, and the lock type is read only. So what's the difference between read-only lock and delete lock? When you implement read-only lock, People can see anything on this resource group, but they won't be able to modify anything. They won't be make any changes to it. For example, they cannot add resources to this resource group. They cannot move resources from these resource group. They cannot make any changes. They can simply read, okay, this is the resource group, these are the resources. They can read anything about it, but they cannot make any changes to this resource group. If you select delete lock, people will not be able to delete these resource groups at all. So let's suppose I created this resource group with the lock delete, and then I went back at the top in the overview pane. In the overview pane, there is an option of deleting the resource group. Now, if I click on delete, it will say, do you want to delete this resource group? I will say yes, and it will say give the name of your resource group that you want to delete. I say this one, and I say delete. And what message gives to me? It says the resource group my RG is locked and cannot be deleted. Why it is so? Because the lock is there, right? But if I remove this lock, you will see that this resource group can be deleted. Also, now you can see that within the resource group, I have one resource available, which is my VNet, right? So that is also available to me within it. So that's the locks that I was talking about. Okay, locks are inherited by child resources. If I go back in here and if I go to my virtual network, see, I implemented the lock at the resource group level. But if I go to the logs of my VNet, you see that it says parent resource logs cannot be edited here. Use the button above to go to the parents log. Since I already put a log at the resource group level, and then I say delete this virtual network, it says I cannot delete this virtual network as well. Why not? Because I implemented a log at the resource group level. Resource group is the logical boundary within which my virtual network is staying, and virtual network inherits every policy that you apply at the resource group level. So if the resource group is locked, every resources within the resource group is locked, even the virtual network which I have created. So even though it does not have a lock of its own, but it has a parent lock which is on the parent resource, that is my resource group. That is why I cannot delete this as well. Okay, that's the benefit of having a resource group. You can control your resources through a group rather than controlling them individually. Okay, like I said, read only lock prevents any changes to resources, and delete lock prevents deletion. Now, moving the resources. Let's suppose you created a resource group and you deployed resources within it, but maybe, just maybe, you wanted to move it to another resource group. Microsoft says that that is possible. You can move your resources from one resource group to another one, right? But there are certain services within Azure that you cannot move from one resource group to another. So check the Microsoft article on this, which services can be migrated from one resource group to another, and which services cannot be migrated from one resource group to another. For example, if you talk about a virtual machine can be moved from one resource group to another, right? But if you talk about express route, which we will discuss later on, these kind of services cannot be moved from one resource group to another one. When you're moving a resource from one resource group to another resource group, in that kind of scenario, all the resources within the resource groups are locked. That means you cannot perform any operation on them. I've already told you how to remove a resource or how to delete a resource and a resource group. So you can simply click on this option, delete resource group and delete, or there is a PowerShell command. To delete a resource group, the PowerShell command I have already shown to you, remove -AZ resource group and then the name of the resource group. And for an appropriate resource, you might need to give the resource ID. So let's suppose you want to delete the virtual network, right? You can use the command which is remove -AZ resource, and then you can provide the information about the resource ID of this virtual network, right? I will let you know how to get the information about the resource ID later on. Okay, so as of now, do not worry about it. I will let you know. So this is what resource manager is all about. Now I have already shown you how to manage resource groups in Portal. It's your responsibility to make sure that you create a resource group through PowerShell, implement a lock through PowerShell on that resource group, and then remove that lock with PowerShell onto that resource group. So quickly try it. That command I will write within my PowerShell. I will give you an idea about that command. So the command that you will be using to implement the lock inside your resource group will be new -az resource lock. This is the command that you will be using. Search for this command and you will get all the appropriate responses. And you might not be using it directly. You have to first give the parameter in here, which is lock name, which can be my new lock, and then you have to give what kind of a lock type it is, which is given by the another parameter, which is lock level, right? Lock level in this case is for read only. It's read only. If you do not want to delete, the name is cannot delete. This is the name of delete lock type. Okay, and then you have to give on which resource or resource group name you want to apply. Okay, this is the command that you will be using for it. So try it. If you want to remove an existing resource lock, the command is remove -az resource lock, right? Followed by what? Followed by the lock name that you have. Simply write the lock name and you will see that lock is removed. Okay. One second. My lock, let me check. Is that the name of my lock? Yeah. One second. Okay, so remove -az resource lock, and let me first get the name of that resource lock first. So I will write this command get -az resource lock, and I have a resource with the name my lock. So okay, this should work. Could not be found. This is strange. All right, no worries, guys. I will check it out. If you are not able to delete it through PowerShell, just let me know and I will check it out. Otherwise, you can simply go to the resource lock from here and you can click on the delete button and it will be deleted. But this is the command that you will use to delete the resource lock. Maybe I'm using something different over there. That's why it is not getting removed, right? So that is how you can delete a resource lock and create a resource lock on Azure. So that is it, guys. That is there in the lesson 3. The lesson 4 is ARM template, which I will be teaching you in the next session. So please remain tuned to my channel. And lesson 4 is ARM templates used extensively for automation purposes. So a lot of this will be discussed. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next class.